Hello, and welcome again to Thresholds podcast. I'm Susan Hollins, and I'm a grief therapist and shamanic practitioner living in Fife. Thresholds arises from my work, which is at the crossroads of psychotherapy and shamanic practice, where grief is honoured as a sacred rite of passage. My last podcast was just before Christmas. Since then we've crossed the turn of the year and moved into this further stretch of winter. The marker of the coming of spring, the feast of Imbolc, occurs on February the 1st. We've reached the time of year when the light lasts just a little longer in the afternoon, even though the mornings remain dark. There's also a sense of something shifting, albeit uneven. We notice the light more at the end of the day than at the beginning. It's a partial and gradual change. And this January, the winter has been cold and very severe. Heavy snow fell in many parts of this country, bringing ordinary life to a halt for days. Then came powerful storms with gale-force winds, flooding, and yet more disruption. It is not a gentle winter. It feels raw and relentless. Mixed within all this, I recognise many people are carrying a great deal of anxiety. Anxiety about what is happening globally, politically, and environmentally. And anxiety too about their own personal lives, their health, their money, their work and relationships. For many people, they struggle to hold both the wider world and their own private challenges together, but it is always out of balance. In my work with grieving people, this time of year also brings a particular kind of weariness. They have somehow managed to navigate the festive season, which is tiring in itself. But at this point, the tiredness feels weighty, that of having carried something for a very long time, without yet knowing when and if they can ever lay it down. So the calendar says that the light is returning, but our inner life doesn't necessarily feel any easier at all. At the start of January, in my Thresholds blog, I wrote about thresholds as doorways, standing between what has been and what is coming. This time of year feels different. It's akin to something stirring in a place in which we are already located. It's less about direction and decisions, and more about sensing, like using our fingertips to feel our way, rather than relying on our rational mind. As people describe their grief to me, I'm reminded again and again of the journeys to the Underworld undertaken by Persephone, by Orpheus, by Eurydice, and how the Underworld is presented as both a place of learning, of losing, and of transformation. The Underworld is frightening not because there be dragons, though there are certainly frightening forms there, but because the conditions in that dimension invite us, if we will, to learn new things, to go at a different pace, to perceive old things in deeper ways. The Underworld is a place where the assumptions we apply in this world fail us. Illusions fall away from us. We're required to be with and within ourselves, to dig deep, and to allow mystery and unknowing to dominate, not rational process. Orpheus lost his beloved Eurydice in the underworld because he couldn't trust the word given to him by Hades, namely, that she would follow him to the entrance of the underworld, and with him out into ordinary time once more, and to share his life, just so long as he did not look behind him. Sadly, this requirement was far more than Orpheus could carry. The underworld isn't somewhere you pass through quickly. Among other things, the underworld is where grief is lived rather than resolved, where truth is faced before it can be transformed, where the work is slow, often invisible, and not helped by superficial encouragement or bright optimism. It's the place of long processes. So there's no fast lane in the underworld. Each of us moves at our own unique pace, the pace at which we can begin to notice not only our surroundings, but also begin to pay attention to our inner self, our inner landscape. Recently, I listened again to a BBC radio drama series called This Thing of Darkness, which explores the psychological impact of murder. It's inspired by a real forensic psychologist and psychotherapist, Dr. Gwen Adshead, and her work in secure prisons in the UK. Listening to this captivating drama, we hear how slowly, over years, healing can emerge, and that it's not guaranteed. This Thing of Darkness speaks about the long, slow work of a prisoner beginning to acknowledge their crime and to take responsibility for it before anything else is possible, before remorse, before change can even be imagined. And often a very long time goes by in which denial dominates the person's mental state, often causing them further major problems. When I heard this, it felt very familiar, not in its circumstances, but in its shape. For when we're grieving, with or without associated trauma, it's akin to being in the underworld. There, something profoundly important has to be recognized, first of all, for which there's neither shortcut nor timetable. And by what I mean by this is that before there can be any sense of integration of our grief and our loss, and before any shift can occur, there's usually a long period of waiting to be able to acknowledge who and what has been lost, and to acknowledge the event or the events which caused the losses in the first place. This deep inner work of coming to a point of acknowledgement of what has happened cannot be accomplished in a single act, but one which must be returned to over and over until we are able to make this powerful acknowledgement. We can describe this also in terms of emerging from shock, in which the death and the loss feel immensely unreal, as if we're in some ghastly waking dream, until one day, possibly months or much longer afterwards, we wake and we know what has happened, and we are able to acknowledge it and to begin to shift a little. And by shifting, I do not mean moving on. When we speak about this early part of the year as one where something stirs, this isn't related to an emergence from the depths of grief, of distress. More subtly, it seems to be about a change within these depths, as a shift from being completely frozen to being able to move just a little. In older traditions, Imbolc was associated with very small signs of life. The birth of the first lambs, snowdrops pushing through hard ground, and yes, the afternoon light lasting a little longer. It seems to me that Imbolc isn't a festival of abundance or of intentions. What, more intentions? It's a festival of just enough. A way of noticing that something has begun to respond, to shift. Even while winter, emotional winter, grief winter, remains fully present. It doesn't deny the season. It pays attention to it. Imbolc is also linked with Brigid, remembered in different ways in different places, as a figure of hearth and fire, of tending and protection. In some traditions, she was welcomed into the home, acknowledged quietly rather than celebrated loudly. There are customs of clearing the hearth, lighting a small flame, making space for warmth and for care. It's all very personal, domestic, bounded. And what I find most meaningful about the figure of Brigid at this time of year is not the idea of light returning, but the concept of tending a hearth, keeping the fire going, making sure it doesn't go out. This feels very familiar to grief work, because when something within us, in our grief, begins to shift, often it's tiny, microscopic, a small, almost imperceptible easing, a moment of breath, a brief sense of being able to bear something which felt completely and utterly unbearable before. One of the hardest parts of grief isn't necessarily the grief itself, but learning how to notice it, how to relate to it, how it changes from day to day like a moody person, and how it asks to be carried within our body, and where it asks to sit there. And these shifts are both easy to miss and to override, to dismiss even. People often tell me that they don't trust them, that they feel disloyal to the depth of their grief if they notice something lighter, or they fear that it just will not, cannot last. And this is where tending matters. Tending is about being attentive, about being. It's also about being careful, caring for, tending that small change, like putting a candle in a dark room and shielding it from the draught. In this sense, tending the hearth at Imbolc may be understood as a way of being with grief. We're not trying to end it. We're not trying to move out of it. But we are being attentive to the thawing of ice, and allowing that to happen without expecting more from it. It is an immense work of patience. For me, Imolc has become a way of speaking about a particular phase of grief, where something is beginning to respond, when we feel less weighed down, more alive, but nothing is finished. Where a grieving person may feel slightly different inside, even though the loss remains powerfully and profoundly present. Where the work of grief remains deep, but no longer quite so sealed up. When we live with grief, this kind of seasonal language can feel far truer than the language of renewal, which seems to imply that we must let go of whatever yesterday had and welcome in whatever tomorrow may bring. It allows for the fact that what is changing within us may not be immediately visible. It may not even be conscious. It may simply be a slight repositioning within us of how we carry the weight of our grief. And so Imolc, in this still early part of the year, may hopefully be less about constantly looking forward and far more about noticing how something is being carried now, how we carry weighty grief compared with how we might have carried it a few weeks ago. But in itself, it's not about carrying the weight, but in how what we carry feels within us and where it's located within us. We return to being attentive. The mornings are still dark. The weather is still rough. The world is deeply troubled. But the light does last a little longer in the afternoon. And sometimes that's just enough to remind us that the season we're in isn't static, even though it still feels very demanding. So here, now, at this point in this year, it may be enough simply to pay attention to how you are carrying what you carry.